shaitanir rajim. We seek refuge in God from Satan the rejected. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. In the name of God, most gracious, most merciful. Salamun alaikum, peace be upon you. God willing, today we want to start another session of the series of studying the appendices of Quran, the Final Testament, translated by Dr. Rashad Khalifa, the Messenger of the Covenant. And God willing, today we want to continue with the rest of Appendix 1. And starting from page 385 with the next table, which is table 11 in the series of the tables of Appendix 1. Major parameters of the Quranic initials, surahs, verses, frequency, first surah and last surah. Table 11 shows that the sum of numbers of surahs and verses where the Quranic initials are found, plus the initials frequency of occurrence in that surah, plus the number of the first surah where the initials occur, plus the number of the last surah where the initials occur, produces a total that equals 44,232 or 19 times 2,348. Thus, the distribution of the Quranic initials in the initial surahs is so intricate that their counts and their placement within surahs are intertwined to give a grand total that is a multiple of 19. It is noteworthy that the initial n must be counted as two n's. This reflects that the fact that the original Quranic text spells out this initial with two n's. All right, so let's break this paragraph and see what it really means. And we can do this by looking at table 11, parameters of the 14 individual Quranic initials. So what does this table tell us if we want to understand it in details? So there are four columns here. If you look at the left one, you see the alphabets that participate in the initial surahs to create the initial letters of those surahs. For example, Surah 2, if you remember, it was Surah Al-Baqarah, the heifer, and it was actually it started with Alef Lam Mim, A-L-M. And the count of, for example, Aleph in that surah was 4,502, right? 4,502. That was the number of the Aleph or A in that surah. Also in the same surah we had Lam. You would see that in the whole surah we have 3,202 Lam and 2,195 Mim. So this is what it means for the second basically column. Okay, so basically we have the number of the surah. The first number is the number of the surah. The second number is the first verse in the surah where that initial has occurred. Obviously it is verse 1 of 99% of the initial surahs, except for one surah that we will get to it. And for example, A has also occurred in Surah 3, verse 1, the first place that it has occurred. A has also occurred in Surah 7, verse 1, and these are the counts of that letter in that surah, okay, or in that chapter within the parentheses. So the numbers within the parentheses are the number of occurrence of that letter in that surah. So this is what it means for the second column that we have here. Now, if you look at ALM, we have already talked about it. If you look at Sod, you see that the first place that it has occurred is Surah 7, verse 1, and there are 97 Sod in that surah, and previously we have talked about. We have Ra, we have Kaf. For example, Kaf, the first place that it has occurred is Surah 19, verse 1, and there is like 137 Kaf in that surah. Ha, Ya, Ain. Okay, so here we have one surah. If you remember, it was Surah 42, and there were two verses in that surah that actually housed 5 initial letters, right? So we had Ha Mim in one verse 1, and then Ain Sin Qaf in the second verse of the same surah. So that was the only surah that had 2 initial verses. The rest of the surahs only had 1 initial verse. God willing, we will talk about it, why it is the case, and this is part of the intricate and intertwined and interlocking mathematical miracle of the Quran, which makes it an awesome thing, an awesome phenomenon. And then we have ta, and then we have sin, then ha, and then qaf, and then nun. So these are the 14 initial letters of the initial surahs. Now, how can we understand that this count is correct down here? Okay, so if you look at this part, basically what we have done is that we have added all these numbers that we have, and this is the summative total of all the numbers that you see in second column. Okay, so how can we understand and how can we check that this number is correct? There is one easy way to do this, and it is using ChatGPT, as I have previously told you about. Right now, we are in an era that we can use this technology to the benefit of our research that we are doing, and it will be really easy to, without knowing any sort of computer, coding, we can easily, use this technique in order to come up with the answers that we are looking for. So let's look at ChatGPT. I have copied and pasted, basically dragged and dropped the whole table here for the second column. Obviously, the whole table was dragged and dropped, and I dropped it into ChatGPT. And then it started doing some calculations on its own, and that's not what I meant. And I started asking it questions, to do exactly what I wanted it to do. And then it did the calculation, and luckily we ended up with the correct number, because sometimes ChatGPT messes up the additions, the summative total, but this time it did it in the right way. So if you look here, you will see that the grand total for that column, the second column, the first column was basically the letters, but the second column was the numbers. It says 43,423, and ChatGPT also says 43,423. So the number checks out. Okay. Now, if you look at the third column in the table here, you would see that it says the first surah. Where was the first surah that these letters have occurred? And as I told you, for example, Aleph, for Aleph, the first surah that it has occurred, it was surah number 2, Lam surah number 2, and Mim surah number 2, obviously because it was surah al-Baqarah, and these are the first places that these three letters have occurred. And then you see that, for example, Noon has occurred. The first place that it has occurred is Surah 68. And the last column on the right is the last surah that initial letter has occurred. For example, for Aleph, the last surah that it has occurred is Surah 32. And you see it here that the last surah which is mentioned here is Surah 32. For Lam, the last surah is Surah 32, and it has been mentioned here, and it has been mentioned here as well. For Mim, the first place was Surah 2, and the last place was Surah 46. So it has been mentioned as first surah and the last surah. So it has been clearly mentioned. The same goes with, for example, Qaf. The first surah has been Surah 42, and the last surah has been Surah 50. So it has been mentioned 42 and 50. And Surah Noon, since there's only one place in the Quran that is initialed with Noon, and that is Surah 68, Surah Al-Qalam, the pen. So the first and the last surah would be the same. So the first surah would be Surah 68, and the last surah would also be Surah 68. So ChatGPT did the calculations for us. The third column, which was this column, first surah where the initial letters occurred, the summative total is 295, this number, 295, and we have it over here, 295. And then the last column, the summative total is 514, and we have it over here, 514. And the grand total of all three columns is 44,232, and we have it over here, 44,232. And interestingly enough, 44,232 is a multiple of 19, and it is 19 times 2,328. So you can see how all these initials and these initial surahs are connected with one another, and we are doing lots of different calculations about these 29 surahs, and they still end up a multiple of 19. And this is the beauty and the intricacy of the mathematical miracle of the Quran. So this was the description of table 11. God willing, we will move on to the next tables, tables 12 and 13. But first of all, let me read this section. A special mathematical coding authenticates the number of verses where the Quranic initials themselves are found. As detailed in Table 11, all Quranic initials occur in verse 1, except in Surah 42, initials in verses 1 and 2 that we just talked about. We have Hamim in verse 1 in this surah, and then Ain Sin Qaf in verse 2 of this surah. This fact is supported by the remarkable mathematical phenomenon detailed in Table 12. If we multiply the first two columns of table 12, instead of adding, we still end up with a total that is divisible by 19. See table 13. So table 12 and 13 are connected mathematically. We're going to take a look at both of them, God willing, and see what they have to offer. At this point, I use ChatGPT in a different way. Instead of just copying and pasting the material into ChatGPT, I took a photo of this. I took a print screen of this table, but I didn't include the last line, which is the summative total of this section. I just wanted to see whether it does the calculation in a correct way. And lo and behold, it was wonderfully calculated, and all the calculations that we have here are correct. So ChatGPT is a wonderful tool that you could use in order to authenticate the calculations that we have here easily. But the point is that you have to be aware that sometimes the calculation that it does are wrong, so you have to check them with several tools in order to make sure that the calculations are correct. Because all the calculations which are here in this document are correct. I have been checking them myself before presenting them to you, and obviously at the same time that I am presenting it to you, I'm showing you the mathematical calculations that I'm doing with ChatGPT to show you that these are not just like I'm not just reading the tables to you. I am doing the math with you as you are just watching this video. So what is table 12? It says mathematical coding of number of verses with initials. Surah number, so these are the surah numbers for the initial surahs basically, right? Starting with surah 2, 3, 7, 10, 11, going on up to 46, 50, and 68. So 68 is the last initial surah, right? Then number of initials. For example, Surah 2, Alef Lam Mim, 3, right? ALM. Surah 3, ALM. Surah 7, Alef Lam Mim Sad. So we have 4, right? So 4 has been mentioned here, right? And then going on, you get to, for example, Surah 68 that we have Noon, Noon Wab Noon. So we have 2. And this is so the second column that is mentioned here. So the number of initials of each surah, right? For the initial verse, the first initial verse. And then the third column states initial verses, right? So all of the surahs, the initial verse is the first verse, right? Except for Surah 42 that we have two basically initial verses. We have the first verse, which is Hamim, and the second verse, which is Ain Sin Qaf. So we have two verses. So the rest of the surahs, it's one, but Surah 42, it's two. Now, the summative total of this section is 822. Now, let's look at ChatGPT. All right, so here I have just copied and pasted basically a print screen of that table here without the last line, which is the summative total. I just wanted to see what does it do with the calculations. And voila, it gives you the correct numbers, right? 822, 822. The second column, 79, 79. The third column, 30, 30. So you have all the three columns with correct actually calculations in ChatGPT. And if you add them up, you end up with 931, which is 19 times 49. And you do the same thing here. You end up with 931, which is the summative total of the three columns. And it is a multiple of 19. 19 times 49. This is just magnificent. This is just beyond probability and beyond statistical calculations at this point. You know, we're dealing with something that it's like a giant Rubik's cube that no matter what you're doing with it, you're ending up with a number which is a multiple of 19. And this is absolutely phenomenal, right? Now, Let's work with the same table. However, in table 13, we're going to multiply the first column, the values of the first column, which is surah numbers of the initial surahs, with the number of initials of the second column. And then we're going to add these numbers together to get to this summative total. Now, if you look at this table, it is concatenated, right? So basically, it is shortened. We have surah 2, 3, 7, but then the rest of it is we just like skip it. We go to 42, then we skip it, we go to 50, and then we go to 68, which is the last one. However, it's very easy. You could use the same thing, which is on the left side, and you can ask ChatGPT to multiply the first column value with the second column value and give you a summative total to see whether we end up with 2022 or not. Now let's go to ChatGPT. Here I ask it, I just said multiple, probably should have said multiply, but it still understood what I meant. Multiply the numbers in the first column with the numbers in the second column and give me a summative total. See, it did that, and all the numbers are here. And if you pay attention, it ended up with 2062, which is a wrong number. Sometimes it messes up the additions. That's what I have paid attention with ChatGPT. So easily, if you copy and paste all these calculations, you're going to end up with a different number here. You're going to end up with 2022, which is the correct number, which is mentioned here, 2022. But ChatGPT ended up with a wrong number for some reason. I don't know what's that reason. That it messes up the additions. Probably it's a problem with ChatGPT. It's a wonderful tool, but it has some mistakes. At the bottom of it, it said ChatGPT can make mistakes. Check important info. So they have a disclaimer down there. So we have to be careful about that. So that number is correct, right? That number which we have here is correct, 2022, and we have 2022. So here we added each column separately and then added all three together. Here we multiplied the first column value with the second column value and then came up with a summative total. Obviously, the third column is still the same because we didn't do anything to it, and that's 30. So we have 2022 plus 30, and it's 2052, and it is a multiple of 19. 19 times 108. You become the judge. Think about all these numbers that we are talking about and see how these surahs are connected to one another. And it's just phenomenal. That I mean, sometimes I become speechless when I think about these numbers and how they are connected to one another, and how the same pattern of multiple of 19 emerges no matter what we do with them. This is absolutely phenomenal. Praise be to God, Lord of the universe. Now, let's continue with the rest of this section. Obviously, it is crucial to have two different initial verses in Surah 42 in order to conform with the Quran's mathematical code. The fact that verse 1 of Surah 42 consists of the two Quranic initials Hamim and the second verse consists of the three initials Ain Sin Qaf has perplexed Muslim scholars and Orientalists for 14 centuries. They didn't know why. By the end of this appendix, the reader will see that every element of the Quran is mathematically authenticated. The elements we are dealing with now are the number of Quranic initials in each initial surah and the number of verses that contain Quranic initials. Tables 11 through 13 have dealt with these two elements that we have already talked about, these three tables. Additional mathematical authentication is shown in tables 14 and 15. In table 14, we have the numbers of all initial surahs added to the number of verses in each surah, plus the number of verses containing initials, plus the geometrical values of those initials. The grand total is 7,030, or 19 times 370. Now let's delve deeper into these tables to see what they have to offer. This is absolutely phenomenal and absolutely fantastic. So I did the same thing with this table, but before putting it in ChatGPT, I wanted to check something myself. So I had to do it one by one to make sure that these numbers are correct. So this table is the complete list of all the initial surahs. So we have the surah's number on the left. So we have starting with surah 2, 3, 7, 10, and going up all the way to 50 and 68. Then we have number of verses in each surah. So Surah 2 has 286 verses. Surah 3 has 200 verses. Surah 7, 206 verses. Surah 10, 109 verses, and so on and so forth. These numbers are correct. I have checked it myself, and I suggest to you that you check it for yourself as well to make sure that nobody's messing with you. And up to this point, I'm sure that you have come to this conclusion. But my point is that checking these numbers is going to strengthen your faith even more, because you see it for yourself that this is just absolutely phenomenal. So this is the number of verses in each surah, right? Then the third column is number of initial verses that we already talked about, right? All the verses are verses 1, and then only Surah 42 has 2 initial verses. And then the fourth column is geometrical value of the initials. Now, what does this mean? If you go to a website called Abjad Calc, it's basically an Abjad calculator website, you can simply copy and paste letters of the initials here, and then you just click on go, and it gives you the number attributed to the letters that you have put there, right? So Aleph, Lam, and Mim. So we know that Aleph is 1, Lam is 30, Mim is 40, right? Aleph, Lam, Mim. So altogether, it becomes 71, right? So this is very easy. Now, if you look at this table, you see that for Surah 2, we have geometrical value of the initials, only the geometrical value of the initial verse, the first initial verse. That's what we are doing here. Surah 3 is also Aleph Lam Mim, so it's 71. Obviously, I have color coded them. We have Surah 29, 30, 31, and 32. They're Aleph Lam Mim, and they are 71. Surah 7 is Aleph Lam Mim Sad. Aleph Lam Mim Sad, it's 161 if you look here, and we have 161. Then we have Aleph Lam Ra in these surahs, 10, 11, 12, 14, and 15. And we have Aleph Lam Ra here, 231 here. And then we have Surah 13, which is different than the other surahs in this sense that it has Aleph Lam Mim Ra, 271. We have 271, and so on and so forth. You can check all these surahs yourself. I have checked it myself, and I have checked all these surahs and made sure that the numbers attributed or related to the geometrical value of the initials in the first verse of those surahs, or the second verse of those surahs, which is for only Surah 42, is correct. For example, Hamim in the surahs is 48, and this, so all the Hamim ones are 48, right? For example, Surah Qaf is 100 because there's only one Qaf, and then Surah Noon, for each Noon, it's Noon Wav Noon, so it's Noon basically, and it's two basically 50s, right? Noon is 50, and then so we have two of them, and so it's 50 plus 50, again it's 100, right? So this is this column, the geometrical value of the initials. And then we have the total. Obviously, it is the total of each line and the summative total of all of it together, right? So I put this one also into ChatGPT. Here it is, the basically the table that I have printed screened, and I have put it in ChatGPT, and I intentionally didn't include the last line, which is the summative total of all these columns. I wanted to see what it does with the calculations. Now it did the calculations, and I asked it to do the calculations. It ended up with these numbers. 822. If we look at here, we have 822 for the first column. Then 2,772. So see, it has messed it up. Now, I had to see it for myself to see what it has done wrong. So I had to copy and paste all these calculations and put it into net and see 2,743. 2,743. Again, that's the one of the weaknesses of ChatGPT. It messes up the additions. God willing, in the next versions, it's going to be solved as well. The third column, previously we have talked about it. We have the addition here, it is 30, and we have 30 here as well in this column. Now, this column was new. Let's see what it has done with this calculation. Here we have 3,435, and here we have 3,435. So it has done the right calculation. And all of it put together, it's 7,030, which is 19 times 370. This is just mind-numbing. It is becoming mind-numbing as we move on, and there are some things that are going to basically blow your mind, but we're not there yet. I mean, this is just the beginning of Appendix 1, and God willing, when we get to those, then your mind will be absolutely blown. Here we have something, it says, remarkably, if we multiply the first two columns of table 14, instead of adding them, we still get a grand total that is divisible by 19, that we have it in table 15. So what did we do here? Remember in tables 12 and 13, so we had here in one situation, we added them up, right? In one situation, we multiplied the values of the first column with the values of the second column, right? Now here we are doing the same thing. We are here multiplying the surah number, the values of the surah number, with the values of the number of verses. It's just like a crazy way of doing things, but we are doing it, and no matter what we do, we still end up with a multiple of 19. And again, if you pay attention, this is a concatenated version of the top table that we have. This is like the open version. This one is the shortened version. We have 237, then 50 and 68. But then easily, if you put the same exact thing in ChatGPT, you're going to be able to ask it questions that you want to ask, and it's going to answer you. Now here I have put it again, and I said multiply the values of the first and the second column and give me a summative total. The summative total that we have here is 60,071. Again, ChatGPT messed it up and didn't give me a correct number. So I had to do it manually, and I had to copy and paste all of this in the net to get to the correct number. Here, 60,071. 60,071. So this is the correct number. Now, the initial number of initial verses stays the same. So it's 30. Geometrical values of the initials stay the same. It's 3,435, same number here. And the summative total is 63,536, which is also a multiple of 19. 19 times 3,344, which is absolutely mind-numbing. So I think this is enough for this session, and God willing, I will stop here, and I will allow you to digest the things that we have already talked about. God willing, in the next session, we're going to talk about the rest of the tables in Appendix 1. Until that time, may God be with you. Salamun alaikum. Peace be upon you.